We're still on to our Global Business Report. That was President Muhammadu Buhari presenting the 2020 appropriation bill to a joint session of the National Assembly comprising the Senate and the House of Representatives live in the nation's capital, Abuja. And this has been much anticipated. We've seen so much expectations from there. And of course, joining me to discuss issues on the budget is Henry Boyo, an economist who is in the Lagos studio with me at the moment. It's good to have you, sir.
Thank you.
So what are your major cues from the President's budget speech?
Well, what is clear is that tradition is probably uppermost in the President's mind, because in reality, in essence, the format remains the same as in all other budgets. What may have changed are the figures. But at the end of the day, the figures really don't tell a true picture, because these are nominal figures. And by the time you convert them, you consolidate them as real income, you'll probably find that the value of over 10 trillion naira budget may really be similar to the 4.5, less than 5 trillion naira of the government in between 2011 and 2012.
Okay.
Basically, what I'm saying is that there is no indication that we have actually, we can actually expect a significant difference in the quality of our lives, nor in the quality of the infrastructure, nor in the quality of the critical areas of transportation, health, and education, because as I have said, it's a traditional budget that retains all those features which have been prominent in the past budgets of the government. Capital budget, which one would expect should receive more attention in terms of allocation, we find is still less than 30% of the total budget.
Indeed.
And this has been the bane all the time. There have been calls that the capital budget should take a more prominent size of the total expenditure of government. But it seems that in the last 6 years or so, government has never been able to bring capital expenditure much above 30%. Having said that, we should also look at how the 30% allocations in the past have truly benefited the country. I recall a week or so ago, the current Minister for, I think it's Power, Mr. Fashola, suggesting that although, is it Power
works
now. You know, he was complaining that of the so much billions that were promised, he only got maybe a fraction of it. So if, for example, one had anticipated that the quality of infrastructure in the road sector would be dependent on the announcement of how much was voted in 2019, one would be totally disappointed by what the Honorable Minister said was the reality. And really, there's nothing to suggest that there's any attempt, meanwhile, to make sure that all projects are truly funded.
All right, Mr. Boyo, I would like us to hold your thoughts on that, but we'd like to go back to the National Assembly and hear what Mr. Femi Gbajabiamila, the Speaker, has to say.
Special advisors and special assistants to Mr. President, heads of government agencies, parastatals, and departments, invited guests, gentlemen of the press, distinguished ladies and gentlemen. On behalf of the National Assembly, it is my honor to express our sincere appreciation to His Excellency President Muhammadu Buhari, GCFR, President of the Federal Republic of Nigeria, for coming to the National Assembly to address this joint session in fulfillment of his constitutional obligation. And I'm deeply sorry about your cold, Mr. President, brought about by the hard work of your good self. Special appreciation also goes to the Secretary to the Government of the Federation, Boss Mustafa, the Honorable Ministers of the Federal Republic of Nigeria, heads of the departments and agencies of the Government of the Federal Republic of Nigeria, and all those who, through their joint efforts, have contributed to this appropriation bill, which we have received today and will shortly begin to consider and deliberate upon. I must also specially recognize our men and women in uniform who on a daily basis stake their lives for our safety. The tradition of receiving the President of the Federal Republic of Nigeria in the legislature for the presentation of appropriation bill is in recognition of the legislator's constitutional obligation to serve as guardians of the purse, in whom resides the absolute authority to make appropriations from the common treasury, in service of the national interest and for the benefit of all our citizens. It also attests to the abiding partnership between the legislature and the executive, without which no meaningful national objective can be achieved. The appropriation bill that Mr. President has presented to us today is a statement of intent. The budget we enact into law will be proof of our priorities and a reflection of the values we hold. What are those values? Integrity, accountability in managing the affairs of state, and absolute commitment to the best interests of the Nigerian people. What are our priorities? Building an economy that provides sufficient opportunity for our people to achieve the dreams they hold dear, equipping our children with an education that prepares them for the challenges and opportunities of a rapidly changing world, protecting the rights of our citizens and securing them for internal and external aggression. This is our commitment, and we will ensure that this commitment is reflected in the 2020 Appropriation Act. There are significant flaws in the process of passage and implementation of our annual national budgets. Some of these problems are structural, others are a function of failures of process and inadequacies in attitude. We intend in this 9th Assembly to improve on these past imperfections and to leave a legacy of budgets that are enacted without rancor, implemented diligently, and that achieve the objectives of national development for which they are intended. We fully intend to return to a January to December budget cycle and to put an end to the policy instability and economic uncertainty that is a consequence of an unpredictable budget cycle. We recognize that our highest ambitions and the collective best interests of our nationhood can only be achieved when the legislature and the executive work together in pursuit of our shared ambitions. Therefore, we will make every effort in this 9th Assembly to achieve constructive collaboration with the executive on all matters of appropriation, implementation, and oversight. We will seek collaboration, but we will not yield on our constitutional obligation to ensure faithful compliance with the letter and spirit of the Appropriation Act by the ministries, departments, and agencies of government. We will strive for big wins, resisting the temptation to bask in the false allure of mediocre achievements, because this moment calls for nothing short of grand ambition and transformative ideas. Above all else, we will hold ourselves in the legislature and others to the highest standards of probity, because to fall short of excellence would be to betray the calling of leadership to which we have all answered. Once more, I thank you, Mr. President, for your presence here today. I thank the Clerk of the National Assembly, Mr. Sonny Omolori, and the entire management and staff of the National Assembly who have worked to make this joint session a resounding success. And I thank all of you. Who have presented yourselves to witness this noblest of democratic traditions. God bless you, and God bless the Federal Republic of Nigeria.
Honorable Niyi Oyelowo will lead us in the closing Muslim prayer. followed after by Senator I.D. Jiang for the Christian closing prayer. Honorable Lemon.
أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. Let us recite Surah Al-Fatiha all together. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم.
All right, if you're still joining us, you're still on to the presentation of the 2020 appropriation bill to a joint session of the National Assembly. And we've just heard the Speaker, House of Representatives, Femi Gbajabiamila, speaking on the aftermath of the President's speech. Now, I've still got with me in the studio Mr. Henry Boyo, an economist, to reflect on this. Now, the Speaker talks about holding values, priorities, probity, etc. Now, are these mere rhetorics on account of the aftermath of the Assembly's own scrutiny via additions or reductions, as it were, of the budget figures over time?
Well, as I said, the budget has, the 2019-20 budget is a true replica of the nature, structure, rendition, content that we are accustomed to having in almost all the budgets we've had post-military.
Yeah.
So this is truly in keeping with what is happening, what has happened in the past. And there is no indication that, put it this way, there is no reason to believe that there is an attempt to truly change the process and deliver. Niyi, there's hardly any budget you would cast your mind on, and I know you've been on this platform for many years, that you wouldn't remember that it was always celebrated as a budget of one thing or the other. I'm not quite sure what the title of this particular one is.
Yeah.
But if we should use the
President's words, economic recovery, diversification, social inclusion.
Yes, absolutely. You know, but there's usually a captive word that they use for these things. Anyhow, whether there is one or not, the important thing is that what do you deliver? And quite honestly, there is no reason to be optimistic that all the lessons of the past have been learned and that this 2019-20 budget would actually do much to our lives. What is significant nominally, optically, is of course that the budget size is much bigger. As I said, 10-point-something trillion or thereabouts. But at the same time, we must remember the 10-point-something trillion at the rate of 300 naira or 305 naira or 360, as the case may be, of naira to the dollar. You're really talking of just about 5 billion. I beg your pardon. You're just talking of about 5 trillion naira in real terms compared to what happened in 2012, 2011, when the budget was just about 4-point-something trillion. But in reality, it was more than what we are having at the moment because the exchange rate was about 160 naira to a dollar.
True.
Today, with 305, 360, 10 trillion naira is half what it used to be. So really, we shouldn't be too optimistic that a smaller budget value would take us to El Dorado, especially when there are areas that have been maybe deliberately or unconsciously omitted. For example, the issue of the fuel subsidy that we have always paid. I didn't hear anything about that.
I was silent.
Is that to imply that we would not pay or would not be allocating? Because once you allocate another 1 trillion or so of fuel subsidy as an expense, then you are really in deep trouble because already you are spending still 70% or so of your expenditure, or of your total revenue on recurrent expenditure, and about just about 25% on capital expenditure. And if you're spending so small on capital, so modest an amount on capital expenditure, especially with a decapitated naira exchange rate, I think it would be simplistic for you to expect that the small amount of money would create greater affluence for the people. there's still the nagging thought that we seem to focus on optical sums of money rather than the real sum of money, the real value of money, and also the structure that drives investment growth and things like this.
Sure.
The president's speech may be 20 billion, 20 trillion, and this, but so long as the budget is predicated or founded on a monetary policy base that is inherently defective and has pauperized us for so long, I think in 12 months' time, I hope I won't be one at this desk, but you really would not be saying, quite honestly, you really wouldn't be saying anything much different from what people may have said about this budget in terms of its defects or deficiencies in the last 10 years or so.
Okay, you've just painted grim realities there for so many people observing this. Now, the president still talks about slowdown in global economic forecast. Now, is this enough to deter Nigeria from growth if only we can think outside of the box? I know you've been an advocate for that for so many times. And based on the current scenario, are we seeing any tilting towards that?
No, we are not, unfortunately, because as I just mentioned, if you keep focusing on the expenditure of nominal sums of money without looking at the underlying structure that drives the whole process, you'll make a big mistake and you would end up being disappointed year in, year out, as we have been over time.
Now, I'm sorry, the reason I asked that was that we've actually seen African countries, you know, some maybe not as much endowed as Nigeria, for example, Ghana and of course Kenya, recently increased their capital base and expanded their economy. So why aren't we toeing that line?
Well, let me explain something that is not generally recognized.
Okay.
The size of the budget itself, I think Nigerians expect almost too much from the amount that is being spent in the budget.
Current realities.
The 10 trillion is what? 10 trillion divided by 3, it's just about 20-something billion dollars or thereabouts. And that's all the government is spending, out of which it will consume 70% of that and only 30% will be left. And even that 30%, as a result of past experiences, past tradition, maybe 50% of it will disappear into private pockets and things like that. So really it is unexpected that you should depend so much on the budget because, as I say, it's just a small, whereas, for example, our economy is supposed to be valued in excess of $100 billion or thereabouts annually. So the reality is that it isn't government that drives the economy. It is the private sector that drives the economy. And no matter how much fiat currency you create in order to say I have a big budget, or how much debt you enter into in order to say I have a big budget, and everybody smiles and say, oh, it's going to be better. No, it won't be better so long as inherently the seeds of another serious Naira devaluation, the seeds of higher rates of inflation, the seeds of higher cost of funds remain. The reality is that in response, government attitude would be, as it has been in the past, to throw more money into the system, either through central bank or whatever. And usually what is the effect of such monetary intrusions, I would call them, not interventions? The effect of such monetary intrusions is, of course, escalation in the liquidity in the system, which creates a ripple that totally destroys any prospect of us growing. And that has been the history for the past 20 years, because if already you have a system underpinning your expectations for growth, and that system encourages an arrangement where the banks can make free money all the time without addressing the needs of the real sector, because the central bank is busy creating fiat currency that creates liquidity surplus in the economy, and then makes it necessary for the same monetary authority to feather bed the banks by offering them mouth-watering interest rates, which attracts their attention from the private sector. So it's easier for you to lend to government when you are receiving an interest rate or 15%, 16%, or thereabouts from whatever government borrows from you, especially when the money you are lending to government also belongs to government. So
a bit of round tripping.
It is round tripping, both on the foreign exchange level and also on the local currency level. So when you have, it's like saying, oh, the budget can be likened to a beautiful design for a wonderful building and things like that, you know. But underpinning it, you have these foundations that are fairly weak, because the foundation of any economy is not so much, as I have said, the rendition of the annual budget or whatever, but the structure that runs the economy. You see, you cannot expect growth, inclusive growth, multiple growth, diversified growth. I mean, this is what is mouthed year in, year out. I mean, you must admit, this is the same thing that's repeated all the time. But that is because you're keeping your eyes off the ball. You keep your eyes on the ball by ensuring, first and foremost, that your economy can support can support an inflation rate of about 1 or 2%. As I've always said, if you want to be an Eagle or Usain Bolt or whatever, you train to be and have the features. You don't have a big tummy and expect that you have that type of thing. You know, so the reality is that what drives any economy anywhere is underpinned by the rate of inflation. As I say, the total money spent by government as budget is peanuts compared to what. So, but the banks are created to drive the economy. And for that purpose, the central bank provides them with plenty of leeway, as low as a 22.5% cash reserve ratio, so that they can, for every kobo you put as a deposit, they would have 5 naira to be able to lend to people.
So
but the interesting
thing
is that,
to a large extent, like the LDRs, where the CBN is also emphasizing on the 60 to 65% LDRs for the banks. Is this also in line with some of your arguments?
You see, I think this is it's farcical.
Okay. It's
really farcical, because to say that banks, you must have 60% loan deposit ratio and this type of thing, you don't have to make that that stipulation. It doesn't have to be enacted. It doesn't have to be stipulated as a directive or whatever.
The banks themselves.
It will come from the banks themselves if the central bank is not in collusion with the banks in order to keep providing excess funds free of charge to the banks and paying 15%. Who is the fool? Why would the banks want to go and lend to a real sector and charge maybe 20% or so, knowing fully well that it is absolutely impossible for any genuine investor to borrow at 20-something% and make a profit or even sustain his business? So you find that unless you yourself, even the budget itself, you must be willing to predicate it on an inflation rate that is sustainable and that can drive the economy. For example, if inflation goes from 11% to maybe 15%, 60%, the whole budget is gone. And if, again, you have a situation where, because you haven't included fuel subsidy, then you find, of course, that the same situation that Mr. Fashola complained about will happen, because the budget, again, for capital expenses will be underfunded, whereas the recurrent expenditure, where the...
Very good. And still on that lack of funding itself, we're seeing a debt service in here, 2.45 trillion naira, which says, so what else do we have to spend on at this rate?
When you, for example, you're spending maybe 30 to 40%
for debt service
of your income on debt servicing. And what would be rationally expected of how would I call it, a good government, that's probably the best way, would be to say, everybody is complaining about our debt service ratios and things like that. We mustn't put our heads in the sand and believe that nothing's happening. You would expect that there would be a need to say, hold on, let's be sensible for a minute. This year we won't even borrow, just so we can reduce. But they're afraid to do that, But the fear is totally misplaced, because every time they have allocated money for the budget, there's no year that you would come and say, oh, the budget was totally implemented or whatever, especially when this January to December year cycle has never been realized. And the Speaker of the House is indicating that, oh, thank you very much, that we will make sure we get to the January. when you get the budget in almost middle of October, and the National Assembly would go on holidays from the middle of December, you have practically 6 weeks, out of which there will be other holidays and things like that. So you can't really be serious if this becomes a recurring problem. Especially, look at the issue of ghost workers and things like that. You still find it being recurring, and people saying, oh, unless you are registered in your... So really, we may not even be standing in one place. We are aggressively marching backwards because we have decided deliberately to close our eyes to the things that lead to inclusive growth. You cannot have inclusive growth ever when inflation is 11%, because the people most hit are the poor, especially also when their incomes and their wages are not rising to the limit of to the level of inflation. That means you are, and this is practical in terms of experience. Every worker is aware of this, that the rate of inflation often goes ahead of how much your wages increase. That in other words, what they're saying is that you will become poorer next year. You know, we know that, but don't think about it because we have this huge figure that we're going to spend. And then you say, the huge figure, will the exchange rate be the same? Will the inflation rate be the same? Then you suddenly find that, next year, December, you are going to be in a tighter spot because the little money you are earning, look, you cannot talk of growth in an economy without looking at the inflation, because, you see, inflation is the precursor of inclusive growth. Inflation is the precursor of cost of funds. Inflation is the precursor of real value in your expenditure. And until you understand that, we will continue to have this type of renditions of budgets, not only by the Honorable President now, but like all presidents that have gone by. Look, you cannot be boasting of progress or development in any way when Nigerians who are over 20 years old or more will tell you, oh, things were better then than now. And not only that, if you want a factual endorsement that you are poorer, I think the International Brookings Institution has already told you that you have now ended up, after all the series of fantastic budgets that have been submitted over the last 20 years or so, that you are now one of the poorest capitals in the world. I mean, and nothing in this budget shows that you are ready to make a change, because the same structure, the same parameters in terms of debt servicing, in terms of refusal to acknowledge a subsidy, in terms of higher rates of inflation. Don't let somebody tell you, oh, but that is a monetary thing. It is all part of a composite thing. If you do not tie your budget to an inflation rate and hold CBN responsible, that, look, man, your main business is price stability, then you do have a problem. You can never achieve your dream. We will repeat this same process again next year, unfortunately.
All right. Unfortunately, well, hopefully something positive will come out of this.
By the grace of God.
Mr. Henry Boyo, economist, I'd like to thank you. Always a pleasure to have you. Many thanks for your thoughts on those issues.
Thank you.
Good to have you.